Tower 1 to ground. Wind's picking up, but I've got eyes on you. Her voice cut through the static, low and distinct, breaking the professional cadence we were supposed to maintain. 300 feet above me, the crane boom sliced through the gray skyline, a steel needle threading the clouds. Down here in the mud and curing concrete, I stiffened. I used safety regulations like armor, a rigid code to keep my focus on the job and off the woman operating that machine. But when she spoke like that, my grip on the clipboard tightened until my knuckles turned white. The construction site had a specific rhythm at 7 in the morning, a chaotic symphony of industry that I knew by heart. It smelled of wet concrete and diesel fumes, a heavy industrial perfume that clung to your skin and hair long after you clocked out. The ground vibrated constantly, a low-frequency hum traveling up through the soles of my heavy boots, grounding me in the immediate reality of the build. I needed that vibration. It was real, tangible, predictable. They called me the Iron Foreman behind my back. I knew it, and I let them. I walked the rebar grid like a hawk, sighting every loose hard hat, every unclipped harness, every misplaced tool. It wasn't just about safety, it was about control. If I could control the site, if I could keep every variable within the green zone, maybe I could control the way my pulse jumped every time the radio crackled. Up there, she was just a silhouette in a glass box, a speck against the sun. But her voice was right in my ear, intimate and omnipresent. We had a protocol. Standard communication only, no chatter, no jokes. Load is securing, she'd say, her tone professional but with a hint of warmth that scraped against my nerves. Copy that, I'd reply, clipping the word short. I refused to let my voice soften, refused to acknowledge the way I tracked her movements against the skyline. My neck ached constantly. That was the physical toll of the job, looking up. You spend your whole day watching the sky, checking for swing, for clearance, for wind shear. But I wasn't just checking the load. I was watching the machine she controlled, treating it like an extension of her body. Around 10, she had to thread a pallet of steel beams between two existing columns. It was a blind lift, the kind that makes junior operators sweat. I was her eyes on the ground. Left 2 degrees, I murmured into the mic, keeping my voice flat. Easy down. The boom moved with a fluidity that shouldn't be possible for tons of steel. It was like watching a dancer or a surgeon. She dropped that load with less than an inch of clearance on either side, a maneuver so precise it made the hair on my arms stand up. The crew cheered, a rough shout of approval. I just let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, physically shaking off the surge of admiration that threatened to crack my composure. That competence was dangerous. It made me want to climb that ladder, regulations be damned. It made me want to see the hands that could manipulate 1,000 tons of steel with such delicate care. I checked my watch, forcing my eyes back to the blueprints. The morning shift was ending, and the sky above us was turning a bruised purple. The deceptive calm of the morning was evaporating, replaced by a charged stillness that usually meant the weather was about to turn against us. Lunch brought a different kind of noise. I retreated to the site office, a corrugated metal box that smelled of stale coffee. I needed the silence. I needed to reset the mask that had started slipping. I spread the schematics for the afternoon pour across the desk, forcing my brain into the comfortable binary of structural engineering. Steel held, or it didn't. Concrete cured, or it cracked. There was no gray area. Then the radio on my belt chirped. Channel 4.
Looks like soup coming in from the west, boss.
Her voice was different now, stripped of the professional curtness. It was lower, rougher. It felt too personal for the open airwaves, like she was whispering directly into my ear. I pressed the transmit button. Barometer is dropping, I said, my voice tight. Wind speed is steady at 15 knots, gusts to 20. We're still green for operations, Miller. Sarah Miller. Everyone called her Skywalker. She had a reputation for fearlessness. That usually meant carelessness on a construction site. But with her, it was just competence wrapped in confidence. I was the one who worried. I was the one who absorbed the anxiety she refused to feel. I looked out the dirty window. The crane was a monolith against the darkening clouds. A small movement caught my eye. The winch line was descending, a small canvas bucket clipped to the hook. It was her lunch run. She couldn't come down, it took 20 minutes to climb the mast, so she fished for her food. One of the apprentices ran out, hooked a bag of takeout to the line, and gave the signal. I watched the bucket rise. It was a lonely ritual. Up there, she was completely isolated, cut off from the warmth of the trailer, the jokes, the terrible coffee. I found myself staring at the steel cable as it spooled upward, disappearing into the gray. I imagined her hands reaching out of the cab window to grab it. I imagined the calluses on her palms, the strength in her wrists as she unclipped the carabiner. I imagined being the one to hand it to her, just for the excuse of that brief, accidental contact. I looked back down at the compliance form, the lines blurring. I was load-bearing. That's the term we use for a wall that holds up the weight of the structure above it. You can't remove it without the whole thing coming down. That's what I felt like. I was carrying the safety of the site, the schedule, the budget. But underneath that, I was carrying the weight of this silence, this massive, unacknowledged thing between the ground and the sky. I was holding up the ceiling while simultaneously praying for it to collapse, just so I wouldn't have to keep standing so still. The weather snapped. 1 minute, the air was heavy, pressure throbbing behind your eyes. The next, the wind shear hit the site like a physical blow. Blue canvas tarps on the supply stacks whipped violently, snapping with the sound of pistol shots. The wind found the rebar skeleton of the building, whistling through the steel grid with a high, mournful shriek. I was out of the office in seconds. The air was gritty, stinging my face with dust. My eyes went immediately to the anemometer mounted on the fence. The cups were spinning so fast they were a blur. The digital readout flickered. 25 knots. 28. Gusting to 35. That wasn't just bad weather. That was the red zone. All stations, this is Foreman. All stop. Secure your loose gear and get to ground level immediately. My voice on the main channel cut through the rising howl, loud and sharp. The response was immediate. The grind of the excavators died. The site fell into a strange, hurried silence, broken only by the wind. But when I looked up, my stomach dropped through the floor. The crane was still moving. She had a load on the hook, a massive I-beam, 40 feet of structural steel. It was hanging, suspended, caught in the open air just as the gusts hit their peak. The wind caught the flat surface of the steel like a sail. The beam swung, a slow, terrifying arc that threatened to smash into the concrete core of the building. Miller! I didn't use the call sign. Miller, drop that load! Get it down now! I forgot the code. I forgot the calm, measured tone of the iron foreman. I was screaming into the radio, one hand clamped over my hard hat to keep it from flying off, the other gripping the radio so hard the plastic creaked. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with liability or insurance and everything to do with the woman in the glass box 300 feet up. The cab was rocking. I could see it from the ground, the mast flexing under the strain. If that beam hit the tower, easy, boss. I've got it. Her voice came back through the earpiece, and the contrast was jarring. While I was unraveling, she sounded like she was sitting in a library. Calm, smooth, almost soothing. It wasn't the voice of someone fighting a machine in a gale. It was the voice of someone who understood the wind, who was negotiating with it, rather than fighting it.
Wind is pushing south,
She murmured, more to herself than me. Compensating. I watched, helpless, grounded in the mud while she danced in the sky. She feathered the controls, chasing the swing of the beam, moving the boom in sync with the gusts to dampen the momentum. It was a display of skill that defied physics. The beam slowed. It steadied. With a surgeon's steady hand, she lowered it the final 10 feet. Clang! The sound of the steel hitting the deck echoed through the empty sight like a gavel strike. It was down. It was safe. I slumped against the fence, the adrenaline crash leaving my knees weak.
Load secure, she said, her voice crackling with static. But I'm pinned, boss. Wind gauge up here is reading 50. I can't climb down in this.
She was right. The external ladder was a suicide run in these gusts. She was safe in the cab, but she was trapped. And I was down here, looking up at the gray sky, realizing that the distance between us had just become infinite. The wind wasn't just weather anymore. It was a wall. 50 knots meant the external ladder was a death sentence. One slip, one gust, and you're gone. But the tower crane had a spine, a hollow steel mast with an internal maintenance ladder. It was tight, dark, and greasy, but it was shielded from the direct assault of the gale. I looked at the anemometer again. The numbers were climbing. She was stuck in a glass box, swaying in the wind, completely alone. The iron foreman would have followed the book. Monitor from the ground, maintain radio contact, wait for the weather to break. But the book didn't account for the way my heart had stopped when that beam swung. It didn't account for the terrifying, magnetic pull of the sky. I keyed the mic, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. Station 1, I'm initiating Emergency Extraction Protocol Alpha 9. Coming up to assist. The lie tasted like copper in my mouth. There was no Protocol Alpha 9. I'd made it up on the spot, a string of official-sounding nonsense to justify a decision that was entirely personal. I didn't wait for a response. I grabbed my climbing harness, cinched the leg straps until they dug into my thighs, and headed for the base of the tower. The inside of the mast was a different world. As soon as the heavy steel hatch clanged shut behind me, the screaming wind muffled to a dull, rhythmic thrumming, like being inside the belly of a massive, sleeping beast. The air here was stagnant, thick with the smell of industrial grease, cold steel, and old dust. It was dark, lit only by the narrow beam of my headlamp, which cut through the gloom to illuminate the endless, vertical tunnel of rungs. I started to climb, hand over hand, boot over boot. The rhythm took over immediately. Climb, reach, pull, step. It was grueling, repetitive labor. The first 50 feet were adrenaline. The next 50 were discipline. By the time I hit the halfway point, it was pure physical punishment. My forearms began to burn, the lactic acid building with every pull. My breath came in short, ragged gasps that echoed in the confined space. But the pain was good. It was grounding. Down on the mud, my mind was a mess of regulations and repressed desire. In the chute, there was only the next rung. The physical exertion stripped away the anxiety, leaving a singular, narrow focus. I wasn't the foreman anymore. I wasn't the boss. I was just a body moving toward another body, fighting gravity 1 foot at a time. As I climbed higher, the tower began to move. Construction cranes are designed to sway. They have to flex, or they'll snap. But knowing the physics doesn't help when you're inside the pendulum. The steel walls groaned, a deep, metallic complaint that vibrated through my gloves. I swung with the mast, a sickening, lurching motion that tried to throw me off the ladder. I had to time my movements, moving in sync with the sway, learning the rhythm of the storm from the inside out. 300 feet is a long way up. It's an eternity when you have time to think about what you're going to say when you get there. Every platform I passed was a checkpoint of my own insanity. Why was I doing this? She was safe in the cab. She didn't need me. But the logic didn't matter. The pull was stronger than the wind. I needed to be there. I needed to see that she was real, that she was whole. My muscles were trembling when I reached the slewing ring, the massive gear assembly where the cab rotates on the tower. This was the end of the tunnel. To get to her, I had to open the top hatch and step out onto the service platform. I had to leave the shield of the mast and step back into the storm. I paused, breathing hard, sweat cooling rapidly on my skin. I checked my safety lanyard, checked it again. Then I pushed the hatch open. The wind hit me like a physical blow, screaming in my ears, tearing at my clothes. The world tilted. The exposure was absolute. I scrambled onto the grating, the wind trying to peel me off the metal, and clipped my double hooks to the railing with hands that shook violently. Not from the cold, not even from the height, but from the proximity. She was right there. The cab was 5 feet away, a sleek glass capsule suspended over the void. I crawled across the grating, fighting the gusts, until I could reach the door. I didn't call on the radio. I didn't wave. I just raised my fist and knocked on the glass, the sound swallowed by the wind, asking to be let in. The latch clicked. The door swung outward, catching the wind for a split second before I hauled myself inside and slammed it shut against the gale. The silence was instant and absolute. It was like stepping out of a war zone and into a recording booth. The howl reduced to a distant, muffled vibration against the reinforced glass. I stood there, dripping sweat, my chest heaving, trying to reconcile the sudden shift in reality. The air inside the cab was warm, recycled, and intimate. It didn't smell like the construction site. It smelled of dark roast coffee, the sharp tang of ozone from the instrument panels, and beneath that, something faintly floral, a specific, personal scent that had no business existing 300 feet above the mud. It was the smell of a private space, transplanted into the sky. The cab was designed for one person. One chair, one set of controls, one body. By stepping inside, I had shattered the occupancy limit. I had to press my back against the rear glass, my boots wedged between the base of her seat and the electrical cabinet. My knees were inches from her elbows. The proximity was aggressive. There was no professional distance here. There was only the unavoidable fact of our bodies occupying the same 4 square feet of space. Miller spun the chair around. I had seen her every day for 6 months. I had seen her silhouette, watched her walk the lot, seen her ID photo. But I had never seen her like this. Not this close. The reality of her was a shock to the system. There was a smudge of black grease high on her left cheekbone, a stark contrast against pale skin. Her hair was pulling loose from its messy bun, strands framing a face that was far too calm for the chaos outside. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and currently crinkled at the corners with an amusement that made my stomach flip. "You made good time," she said. Her voice wasn't filtered through the radio static anymore. It was clear, low, and terrifyingly real. It vibrated in the small space, resonating in my own chest. I cleared my throat, desperate to retreat behind the armor of my role. "Standard procedure," I lied, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. "Visual inspection of the load computer. Mandatory during high wind events." It was a weak lie. The load computer data was mirrored on my tablet on the ground. She knew it, I knew it, but she didn't call me on it. She just leaned back in the chair, the movement bringing her knees almost to touch my thighs, and gestured to the console. "Be my guest, boss. Inspect away." I reached for the diagnostics panel, forcing my hands to move with a steady, clinical precision I didn't feel. I tapped the screen, scrolling through wind speed logs and load moment indicators, staring at the numbers without actually seeing them. I was performing competence, acting out the ritual of the Iron Foreman, because if I stopped, I would have to acknowledge that I had climbed a 30-story ladder just to be near her. She watched me. I could feel her gaze on the side of my face, heavy and unblinking. She wasn't looking at the screens. She was looking at my hands, at the tension in my jaw, at the way I was holding my breath. The cab swayed gently in the wind, a rhythmic, hypnotic motion that felt entirely different from the violent lurching in the ladder chute. Here, it felt like being rocked. The city below was a grid of shadows, a world we were floating above. We were in a glass bubble, suspended in a void where the rules of the ground didn't apply. The silence stretched, thick and sultry. It wasn't an empty silence. It was pressurized. It was the heavy, charged air before a lightning strike. I could hear the hum of the heater, the soft click of a relay, the sound of her breathing. "Wind's dropping," she said softly. "Look." She pointed to the analog wind gauge on the far side of the console. To see it, I had to lean over her. I shifted my weight, reaching out to tap the glass of the gauge, a reflex to confirm the reading. As I reached, the crane shifted. My balance wavered just a fraction. My hand dropped, and my fingers brushed against the shoulder of her heavy work jacket. Snap! A spark of static electricity, blue and sharp, jumped between us. It was loud in the quiet cab. I jerked my hand back like I'd been burned, the sting traveling all the way up my arm. It wasn't just static. It felt like a circuit closing. It felt like the inevitable collision of two high-voltage lines that had been running parallel for too long. I froze, my hand hovering in the air, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Miller didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just looked at where my hand had touched her, then slowly, deliberately, lifted her eyes to meet mine. The amusement was gone, replaced by something darker, something focused and intense that pinned me to the glass wall more effectively than the storm ever could. "You know, you could have sent the new guy," Miller said. She didn't rub the spot where the static had stung her, but her gaze dropped to my hand before flicking back to my eyes. Her voice was low, stripping away the pretense of the storm outside. "Junior safety officer isn't rated for ladder climbs in conditions over 30 knots. I lied. The words tasted like ash. The new guy was 22, climbed rock walls on the weekends, and had been begging for a tower cert. He would have sprinted up that ladder. Miller smiled, a slow, knowing expression that made the breath hitch in my throat. She knew the roster better than I did. "Right," she said softly. "Regulations." She turned back to the panoramic window, looking out at the horizon, where the storm was breaking apart into bruised clouds. "I like it up here," she said, her tone shifting, becoming more contemplative. "It's quiet. No shouting, no engines, just the wind and the work." "It's isolated," I countered, needing to say something, anything to fill the heavy air that seemed to be compressing around us. "It is," she agreed. "Gets lonely. You start looking for things to focus on. Patterns, movements." She swiveled the chair slightly, the leather creaking in the silence. "I watch you, you know." My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt too loud for the small space. "You watch the sight," I corrected, my voice tight, defensive. "It's your job to monitor the ground." "No," she said. And she looked right at me then, her eyes dark and serious, stripping me bare. "I watch you. I watch the way you pace the perimeter every morning at 7:15. I watch the way you check the rebar ties twice, even after the inspector has signed off. I watch the way you stand by the gate when the truck's back in, hands on your hips, like you're daring them to make a mistake." The air in the cab seemed to vanish. I had spent months thinking I was the observer, the silent guardian watching the sky. I thought I was hidden by the glare of the sun, by the distance, by the helmet and the safety vest. But she had been up here, looking down through the glass floor, tracking my yellow helmet through the grid of gray steel, like a beacon. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just watching. I was being watched. The obsession wasn't a secret I was keeping. It was a shared frequency we had both been tuning into. "You pace when you're worried," she continued, her voice dropping to a murmur that felt tactile, like a finger tracing my spine. 3 laps around the foundation pit. You did 4 today. The denial died in my throat. There was no point. She had mapped my anxiety from 300 feet up. She knew my rhythms better than I knew them myself. Below us, the city streetlights flickered to life, amber chains illuminating the wet pavement as dusk settled. The construction site transformed from a gray wasteland into a complex map of deep shadows and sharp industrial angles. The cab felt suddenly darker, smaller. The instrument panel glowed with soft green and red lights, casting shadows across her face, highlighting the curve of her jaw, the line of her throat. It felt less like a workspace and more like a cockpit, a capsule adrift in the night, entirely separate from the earth. Miller unbuckled her seatbelt. The click was deafening in the quiet. She stood up. The cab was not built for standing, certainly not for 2 people. As she rose, she unfolded to her full height, and the space between us evaporated. I had nowhere to go. My back was already pressed against the cold glass of the door. She stood in front of me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her body, close enough to see the pulse jumping in her neck. She stretched, arms reaching up, arching her back. It was a casual movement, but in that confined space, it was devastating. Her jacket rode up slightly. I saw the line of her waist, the heavy leather of her tool belt, the way her work pants fit her hips. I forced my eyes to stay on her face, but it was a losing battle. The air was thick, sultry, charged with everything we hadn't said for 6 months. "Wind's down," she said, her voice rougher now. She nodded toward the anemometer without looking away from me. The numbers were falling. 15 knots. 12. Green zone. It was safe to leave. The emergency was over. Protocol dictated I open that door and climb down immediately. But my feet felt welded to the floor. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. I wanted to stay in this glass box where the only thing that mattered was the electricity crackling between us, where the rest of the world was just a silent movie playing out far below. "We have to go," I said. The words felt heavy, like stones in my mouth, dragging us back to reality. Shifts over. Storms finally cleared. Miller didn't argue. She nodded, reaching for her climbing harness where it hung on the back of the chair. "Wait," I said, stepping forward. The reflex to take control kicked in, a desperate attempt to reestablish the hierarchy. "Let me check it. Mandatory equipment inspection after a high-stress event." It was a lie. We both knew it. But she dropped her hands, standing still in the center of the small glass box, offering herself up to the scrutiny. I stepped into her space. I had to. I reached around her waist to check the lumbar straps, my arms encircling her for a brief, dizzying second. The heat of her body radiated through the heavy canvas of her work jacket. My hands found the buckles at her hips. I gave them a sharp tug, testing the tension. She didn't move, but I heard her breath hitch, a small, sharp intake of air that was louder than the wind outside. I moved to the chest harness. My fingers traced the nylon webbing up her torso, deliberate and slow. I checked the carabiner at her sternum, the metal cold against my fingertips, her chest rising and falling rapidly beneath it. I was checking for fraying, for stress fractures, for loose stitching. That's what the report would say. But my hands were memorizing the solidity of her, the way she held her breath as I leaned in, the way her scent, coffee, and ozone overwhelmed the industrial smell of the cab. "Secure," I whispered. I didn't step back. Secure, she echoed. Her eyes locked on mine, dark and unreadable. I forced myself to turn away, to open the hatch. The cold air rushed in, shattering the bubble. I'll lead, I said. Stay close. The descent was a different kind of torture. I went first, lowering myself into the dark throat of the mast. The ladder rungs were slick with condensation. I moved slowly, deliberately, conscious of every movement. Above me, Miller followed. I was hyper-aware of her body, moving just inches above my head. I could hear the scrape of her boots on the steel, the rhythm of her breathing, the rustle of her jacket. In the narrow chute, the intimacy was suffocating. I found myself pausing, looking up to guide her feet to the rungs, my hand brushing her ankle, her calf. Got it? I asked, my voice echoing in the shaft. I got it, she replied, her voice vibrating through the steel structure. The physical exertion of the climb down acted as a pressure cooker. The adrenaline of the storm hadn't faded. It had just mutated into something sharper, heavier. My muscles burned, trembling with fatigue, but my nerves were wired tight. Every rung brought us closer to the ground, to the rules, to the reality where I was the boss, and she was the operator, and we didn't touch. I didn't want to reach the bottom, because the bottom meant distance. When we finally hit the base level, my boots sank into the mud. It felt alien, wrong. The ground felt unstable after the swaying of the tower. I stumbled slightly, and I heard Miller drop down behind me, her boots hitting the slush with a wet thud. The transition was jarring, a return to gravity. The site was empty. The crew had gone home hours ago. The silence of the ground level was vast and exposing compared to the insulated intimacy of the cab. The floodlights hummed, casting long, stark shadows across the puddles. Office, I said, gesturing toward the trailer with a hand that wasn't quite steady. We need to log the incident. Paperwork. Right, she said. Paperwork. We walked across the lot, the mud sucking at our boots. We didn't touch, but the air between us was charged, a magnetic field that kept pulling me toward her. The distance we walked felt like a tightrope, and I was terrified of falling off. I unlocked the trailer door with a hand that was finally, betrayingly, starting to shake. The fluorescent lights flickered on with a harsh, buzzing hum that banished the shadows of the storm, but did nothing to dispel the charge in the air. This room was my territory. This was where I kept the schedules, the budgets, the disciplinary forms. It was a space defined by hard lines and clear rules, and I needed that structure like a drowning woman needs a raft. I retreated immediately behind my desk, putting the scarred laminate surface between us. It was a flimsy barricade, but it was all I had. I grabbed a blank incident report form from the stack, my pen hovering over the date field. I didn't look up. I couldn't. If I looked at her now, under these unforgiving lights, with the smell of the storm still clinging to her jacket, I knew the iron foreman would crumble completely. Sit down, I said, my voice tight, clipped. We need to log the wind speed at the time of the climb. We need to document the reason for the manual override on the descent protocol. The safety director is going to want a full explanation for why we were on the ladder in a red zone. I was babbling. I was throwing regulations at her like sandbags, trying to hold back a flood. I focused entirely on the paper, the black ink of the pen digging into the page. Miller didn't sit. I could feel her standing in the doorway. She was still wearing her climbing harness, the heavy nylon straps crisscrossing her chest and thighs, the metal buckles catching the light. In the sterile office, the gear looked aggressive, out of place. It was a visual reminder of the danger we had just shared, of the physical reality of her body moving against gravity. She didn't take it off. She just stood there, leaning against the frame, watching me build my wall of bureaucracy. The anemometer reading was 50 knots, I continued,
writing the number down, underlining it twice. That's a mandatory site shutdown. Technically, we should have waited for the extraction team, but given the instability of the load, Sophia, she used my first name. Not boss, not foreman, Sophia. It stopped my pen in mid-stroke. The sound of it in this room, where I was only ever a rank and a last name, felt like a violation of the building code. "I'm filling out the report, Miller," I said, my voice rising, desperate to drown out the intimacy. "We have to follow the process. If we don't document this correctly, insurance will—" She stepped into the room. She didn't rush, but the movement was decisive. She closed the door behind her. The latch clicked shut, a sharp metallic sound that sealed the room. The hum of the construction site outside, the distant traffic, the wind, vanished. It was just the two of us, the buzzing lights, and the sudden, suffocating lack of oxygen. "Stop," she said. It wasn't an order, it was a plea wrapped in steel. "I can't stop," I snapped, finally looking up, ready to fight, ready to use my authority to push her back to a safe distance. "I have to— I can't watch you up there without thinking about touching you." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. She didn't say it like a line from a movie. She said it like a confession she had been carrying up that ladder every single day for 6 months. Her voice was low, rough with exhaustion and adrenaline, and completely unflinching. My brain simply stopped processing. The pen slipped from my fingers, rolling across the desk with a soft hiss. In my left hand, I was holding my clipboard. In my right, I was gripping my yellow hard hat by the brim, holding it like a shield. My grip failed. My fingers went numb, the signal from my brain to my muscles severed by the shock of hearing my own internal monologue spoken in her voice. The clipboard hit the desk first, sliding off the edge to the floor. Then the helmet dropped. Clack, thud. It hit the linoleum hard, spinning on its crown, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. It wobbled, spun, and finally settled near my boots. I didn't reach for it. I couldn't move. I stood frozen behind the desk, my hands empty, my chest tight. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a load-bearing wall, finally giving way. The iron foreman was gone. The regulations were gone. There was just me, stripped of my armor, staring at the woman who had seen through it all along. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of the height. I wasn't afraid of the wind or the insurance liability. I was terrified of this. I was terrified of the way the air in the room seemed to bend toward her, of the sudden, vertigo-inducing realization that the forbidden attraction wasn't a secret I was keeping from her. It was a secret we had been keeping together. My voice cracked. I cleared my throat, but the authority didn't come back. "You shouldn't say that." "Why?" Miller asked. She didn't move closer, but she didn't back down. Her eyes were dark, tracking the flush that I knew was rising on my neck. "Because of the regulations? Or because you're thinking it too?" I looked down at the helmet on the floor. It lay there like a discarded shell. I looked back at her, at the grease smudge on her cheek, at the intelligent, terrifying demand in her eyes. The fear was real, but the pull was stronger. It was a gravitational force I had been fighting for half a year, and I had just run out of fuel. She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need one. My silence was loud enough. Miller pushed off the doorframe, moving with that same fluid economy of motion she used in the cab. It wasn't aggressive, but it was inevitable. A gravitational pull I couldn't legislate away. I took a step back. My hips hit the edge of the desk, the laminated wood digging into my lower back. That was it. The end of the line. There was nowhere left to retreat, no forms to hide behind, no distance left to measure. She stopped exactly 6 inches from me. She invaded my personal space, but respected the final invisible barrier of my body. She was close enough that I could see the gray flecks in her dark eyes, close enough to track the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat, right above the collar of her work shirt. The air between us was heavy, physical, like the pressure drop before a tornado. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a jarring, artificial sound that usually drove me crazy, but now I barely heard it over the rushing of blood in my ears. She didn't touch me. She just stood there, hands loose at her sides, waiting. She was giving me the choice. She had crossed the site, climbed the ladder, and closed the door, but she was leaving the final inch to me. I looked at her, stripping away the labels: operator, employee, subordinate. I saw the exhaustion in the lines around her eyes and the terrifying openness of her want. The consent didn't happen in words. It happened in the shift of my weight, the way my hands unclenched, the way my breath shuddered out. It was a surrender. I reached out first. My hands felt heavy, clumsy, as I grabbed the thick, rough canvas of her lapels. I didn't pull her gently. I yanked her forward, collapsing that final distance with a desperation that frightened me. We didn't kiss. Not yet. It was a collision. Our foreheads met with a solid, grounding impact that jarred my teeth. I closed my eyes, letting out a sound that was half sob, half sigh. It wasn't about romance in that second. It was about stability. It was about finding a structural anchor point in a world that had been spinning for months. We just breathed, sharing the same jagged air. I could feel her warm breath against my lips, hot and smelling of coffee. I could feel the heat of her radiating through the layers of our work clothes. It was the most intimate thing I had ever felt. I thought I was making it up, I whispered against her skin. My voice was wrecked, stripped of all its command. I thought it was just the stress, the job. It's never been just the job, she murmured back. Her voice was a rumble in her chest, vibrating directly into mine. Her hands moved then. They came up slowly, hesitant for a fraction of a second before settling on my waist. They were heavy, solid hands, calloused palms pressed through my shirt, their weight anchoring me to the floor. She gripped my hips, pulling me flush against her, aligning our bodies like she was locking a load into place. The metal buckles of her harness pressed into my stomach, hard and unforgiving. But I didn't care. I wanted the bruise. I wanted the proof. My hands moved up from her lapels, sliding over the rough canvas of her shoulders, finding the nape of her neck. Her skin was warm, damp with sweat. I dug my fingers into the hair at the base of her skull, finally finding the elastic tie that held her messy bun together. I pulled it free. Her hair tumbled down, dark and heavy, falling over my wrists like a curtain. It was softer than I expected, smelling of rain and the sweet, specific scent of her shampoo. I buried my hands in it, messing up the efficient style, destroying the professional silhouette she wore for the world. "You have no idea," I said, the words tumbling out low and fierce. "You have no idea how hard it is to watch you. To see that bucket go up. To hear your voice in my ear all day and not be able to do this." "Then stop watching," she breathed, her nose brushing against mine, the friction sending sparks through my nerves. "Just start touching." The kiss finally broke the dam. It wasn't a movie moment. It was a structural failure of the best kind. When her mouth found mine, it was a collision of necessity, a release of 6 months of pressurized silence that tasted of stale site coffee and pure exhaustion. It was messy, desperate, and perfect. My teeth grazed her lip. The rough canvas of her jacket scraped my neck.
I felt the cold metal of the zipper on her chest pressing against me, biting through my shirt, a sharp, grounding contrast to the overwhelming heat of her mouth. The sensation was absolute. The iron foreman dissolved, leaving just Sophia, shaking and hungry for the contact I denied myself for so long. I needed to be closer. The height difference was wrong. Her boots, my leaning posture, it was too much distance. I gripped her waist, my fingers digging into the heavy fabric of her work pants, and shoved a stack of blueprints aside with my elbow. They scattered to the floor, ignored. With a grunt of effort, I lifted her. She went with the movement easily, her hands clamping onto my shoulders as she hopped up to sit on the edge of the desk. Now we were eye level. I stepped between her knees, the heavy denim of her pants brushing against my thighs, locking us together. I was the load, and she was the anchor. My hands tangled in her hair, messing up the efficient bun even more, needing to feel the reality of her. The air in the room was thick, charged with the scent of ozone and desire, a private atmosphere that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The office walls, usually so sterile, seemed to close in around us, creating a sanctuary. "You drive me crazy," I murmured against her mouth, the words vibrating against her lips. "Every time you key that mic, every time you say, 'copy that,' in that low voice. I wanted to climb the tower and cut the radio just so I could hear you say it to my face." She laughed, a low, throaty sound that I felt in my own chest. She kissed my jaw, her lips trailing heat down to the pulse point hammering under my collar. "You think you're subtle?" she whispered, her hands roaming over my back, tracing the line of my spine through my shirt. "I hear the way your breath catches when I correct a swing. I hear the silence before you answer. It's the loudest thing on the channel." My hands found her face, cupping her jaw, my thumbs brushing the grease smudge on her cheek. The skin was impossibly soft compared to the grit of the day. "I hated you for being so good," I confessed, pulling her back in for a deeper, slower kiss. This one was different, less desperate, more savoring. It was a sultry exploration of the territory we had just claimed. I hated that I couldn't fault you on anything. I wanted to write you up just to have you in the office. "Well, I'm here now," she said, her eyes dark and dilated, staring right into me. No write-up required. Her hands moved to my shoulders, kneading the muscles that had been locked tight since the morning shift. I pressed closer, needing to erase the memory of the empty air between the ground and the cab. We kissed again, slow and deep, a confirmation of everything the silence had promised. It felt like a suture closing a deep wound, the edges of our separate isolations finally being stitched together. The fear of the fall was gone, replaced by the certainty of her weight against me. We pulled back just enough to breathe, foreheads resting together, the safety protocols of the site forgotten in the absolute safety of her embrace. The final image was quiet. We left the site office, the helmet retrieved from the floor and placed on the desk, a silent monument to the rules we'd broken. We walked to our trucks in the parking lot, the gravel crunching under our boots. We didn't speak, but our hands brushed, a deliberate, heavy contact. Behind us, the massive crane was silhouetted against the night sky, no longer a threat, but a witness. If you've ever found love where you were supposed to be working, subscribe.